Hello, I'm Tony Guida. Welcome to My New York. Appalling is the word for today. The appalling story of a shameful episode in the history of this city and this nation. It is told in this book, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga. The book was written by Pamela Newkirk, a professor of journalism at NYU, and she is here to tell us this heartbreaking tale. Next. This is the book, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, written by Pamela Newkirk. Welcome to our program. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. Who was Ota Benga?
Well, Ota Benga was a young Congolese man, probably a teenager, who in 1904 was brought to St. Louis to be exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair.
Brought from the Congo.
Brought from the Congo.
Kidnapped in the Congo.
Pretty much. He was brought by a man who was heavily armed and commissioned by organizers of the St. Louis World's Fair to bring back so-called pygmies, diminutive people of the Central African forest, to exhibit on the fairgrounds as an example of the lowest form of civilization. So Ota Benga was one of 9 young men who were brought to St. Louis to exhibit at the fair.
And 2 years later, exhibited in New York.
He ended up on exhibit in the Monkey House in a cage with an orangutan.
He was shown in the Bronx Zoo, in the Monkey House, in a cage,
right,
with other primates.
With a sign up describing him in a way that you would describe an animal. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers flocked to the zoo to see this poor young man who was locked in this cage.
It was a spectacle, as you title the book.
Yeah, it was a major sensation in New York City.
Reported by all the newspapers, the New York Times among them.
Yes.
Among the accounts. And as I understand it, something like 200,000 people.
Yeah, close to 250,000 people visited during the 3 weeks that he was on exhibit.
In September of 1906.
Yes.
Why? I mean, you talk about he was brought forcibly to St. Louis to be exhibited, and then a couple of years later, why?
Well,
what was the...
Yeah, there was this obsession at the time with this idea of a missing link about, these people, I guess, I don't know what you would call them, but these specimens who were somehow midway between apes and human beings. And so this was an idea that was percolating in scientific communities at that time. And so Ota Benga, for many people, was the embodiment of this missing link. And the reason why there was such fascination with Ota Benga is because besides his small stature, he had teeth that had been chipped into points that the person who brought him here was able to easily depict him as a cannibal, as a savage. Of course, he was not. It was a popular conceit across the Congo of young men who did this as a form of bravery. In some villages, no young woman would even look at you if your teeth were not beautifully chipped in this way.
Like that.
But in the American context, it allowed Samuel Werner, the African explorer who brought him here, to depict him as a cannibal and as a savage.
Well, you say that this was a popular scientific belief at the time, and I guess it's important. I know it's important to note that the exhibition of this young man was supported by all the leading scientists of the time and the leading thinkers of the time.
One of the most eminent scientists of the time was Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was one of the trustees of the Bronx Zoo and who was intimately involved in the the idea to exhibit Ota Benga.
And William Hornaday was one of the co-founders of the zoo, and,
Well, he was
one of the world's leading zoologists.
Right. He was the founding director of the zoo. And also the founding director of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. So before he came to New York, he was founding director of the National Zoo.
And Hornaday wrote glowingly of this exhibition He sort of, I mean, in the writing that you include in the book, I mean, he sounds like a P.T. Barnum. I mean, he's pushing this thing.
Yeah, he sounds like a P.T. Barnum, except, as you say, he's the nation's most renowned zoologist, right? Close friend of Teddy Roosevelt, who by this time is President of the United States, one of the nation's leading conservationists. So he was, an eminent man in his own right. And so these men of science thought this was a perfectly fine idea to exhibit this young African in a cage with an orangutan. But at the time, if you looked into an encyclopedia and you looked up African, you would see someone who was midway between an orangutan and a human being. So these were ideas that were so deeply embedded in the science, and that is why the New York Times did not even understand why anyone would protest this exhibit.
Yeah.
Because according to their information.
In fact, the Times wrote or published an editorial at the time. There was eventually, and within a few days, this was roundly opposed as black ministers trying to make their voice heard.
Well, they were in a small minority.
Yeah.
Most people accepted it as a wonderful exhibit.
Exactly. And I only wanted to make the point that, as you point out in the book, some prominent African-American leaders in the city tried to be heard in protest of this and got nowhere.
Right.
So, leading to your point that various organizations and people and entities like the New York Times didn't understand why would anybody protest this. And this is the editorial that appeared in the New York Times. Let me read this to you. Ota Benga, according to our information, is a normal specimen of his race or tribe with a brain as much developed as those of its other members. Whether they are held to be illustrations of arrested development and really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes, they are of equal interest to the student of ethnology and can be studied with profit.
Right.
That was in the New York Times.
That was in the New York Times. So this was a prevailing ideology, right? That Africans were people who could be exhibited and studied like other animals, not fully human.
1906. We're talking September 1906.
Right, the dawn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right.
40 years, roughly, since the end of the Civil War.
Right.
You mentioned Werner, this fellow Samuel Werner, who was the man who brought Ota Benga and others from the Congo to the United States. And he comes off in your book, he sounds like a man who was, if you put all the parts together, who was essentially a fraud. He was a failed missionary.
Right.
He was a self-styled explorer of Africa, an avowed white supremacist, and at times he was mentally unstable.
Yes, all of that.
And this is a guy who somehow gets the assignment to bring Africans over here.
But let's face it, not many white men were willing to go into Central Africa. I mean, people were dying of malaria and all kind of illnesses. So the fact that he even was willing to go says something.
Yeah,
it's not like people were lining up to go into Central Africa at that time.
It just so much of this story confounds the brain and the heart.
Right.
And how a guy like this was able to persuade renowned scientists, you should take this guy and put him on exhibit in your
Well,
zoo.
I don't even think it was Werner's idea to put him on exhibit in the zoo. I think that was Hornaday's idea. Werner was just supportive of it because he was kind of desperate. He needed a place to put Ota Benga. He was running from the sheriff. He was he had bounced checks and there was a warrant for his arrest. And so he was trying to get out of New York, and so he was looking for a place to kind of dump Ota Benga temporarily. Ota Benga had already caused a stir at the American Museum of Natural History, where he had been living for a few weeks. And so he takes him to the zoo along with monkeys he had brought back. And he was trying to sell the monkeys to the zoo. Mm-hmm. And Hornaday said, but I'll take him too. So, I mean, he was willing, but I think it was Hornaday who really got the idea to exhibit
Well, Hornaday
him.
apparently knew a meal ticket,
Precisely.
when he saw one.
And he was right, unfortunately, right? It was a popular exhibit.
I mean, you point out in the book that in the 3 weeks he was at the zoo in September of 1906, they counted through the turnstile almost 250,000 people, which is twice as many as the
preceding
September.
Exactly.
So it was a huge
sensation.
Success.
And the headlines were not only in New York, but eventually across the country and throughout Europe.
Yeah. And to the opposition, or to the faint pleas that this was not humanitarian, Hornaday wrote that, to the contrary, he said, Ota Benga is lodged comfortably in one of our best rooms in the primate house.
Right. And that was his defense. Come on, we gave him the best room in the primate house. And he told that to the New York Times.
The question that cries out, among others, is, first of all, your book came out recently. First time we've ever hearing about this. How's this story been out of the public, not been reported?
Well, it's been sanitized. So in 1974, the Bronx Zoo, in its own historical account of the founding of the Bronx Zoo, goes through all of the years from 1899, the beginning, and then it mentions Ota Benga, but it curiously says that it's unlikely that he had ever been exhibited.
This is in the history, the Bronx Zoo's own history.
Right, written by the man who at the time was the curator emeritus, who presided over their archives. He said that it's unlikely he had ever been exhibited, and that but that's all we could know from this distance and time, except it was all done with Ota Benga's best interest and the interest of New Yorkers. Okay, so there was that. And
so
then,
they're washing their hands of this.
Pretty much, and saying it's unlikely when there were voluminous documents in their own archives, documenting daily what was going on with Ota Benga in the zoo, and also in its own zoological bulletin, the New York Zoological Bulletin, the Bronx Zoo Bulletin, had an article about the exhibit during that time. So that was one account. And then in the 1990s, Samuel Werner's grandson wrote a book about the friendship between Samuel Werner and Ota Benga, which is what got my antenna raised, because I don't know about you. I don't have friends like that.
No.
And then, but also in 1916, when Ota Benga died, the New York Times, which had written more than a dozen articles on the exhibit while it was happening, said that it was urban legend, that it had never happened, that he worked for the zoo. And
the Times as well was whitewashing it.
And I don't know if it's because the reporter who wrote the article did not look at the archives, didn't go to the files and was just going by what the Bronx Zoo was saying at that time. But no matter, this is how the history has been recorded. It's been just a historical fraud. In part maybe error, in part maybe misremembering, but in the end, it was a historical fiction that had been perpetuated as the true story of Ota Benga.
Well, this is a good time for me to tell our viewers that I invited the zoo or the New York Zoological Society or the Wildlife Conservation Society, which runs the zoo, to offer to have a representative on this program to talk about their involvement in this or to send us a statement. I reached a person in their communications department and said, this is what I'd like. Never heard back. So we are here without their point of view, although we tried to get it.
But I should add that they were very accommodating. When I was doing my research, there were no files that I could see they were holding back.
Right.
In fact, I would not even know the details without the records that were kept by the Bronx Zoo.
Well, it's admirable that they gave you access to the archives. Perhaps they could also admit or apologize or at least correct the record.
Yeah, that would be nice. And also maybe a little plaque or some kind of, some way to honor Ota Benga's memory at the Bronx Zoo, I think would be fitting.
Since you mentioned your delving into the archives of the New York, of the zoological side of the zoo, we should mention that your book is not based on your opinions.
Oh, no.
But it's full of
all primary documents,
right.
correspondence, anthropological field notes, photographs, Samuel Werner's own autobiographical writing about what happened with Ota Benga. He published many articles, one in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which was titled something like How I Hunted Pygmies in Africa. So this was not something he was ashamed of. I mean, he went hunting for these people to bring back to St. Louis.
Were you able to fix how old this young man was when he was actually on display?
Well, if you look at the picture of him, I mean, he's obviously a young boy. Later in his life, when he was living in Lynchburg, Virginia, he told someone he was 13 years old when he was captured in the Congo, which would have meant that he was about 15 when he was at the Bronx Zoo, and then about 25 when he died 10 years later.
From the records as they exist, what were you able to learn about him? What kind of a person was he?
Well, so by all accounts, he was bright, intelligent. He had a sense of humor. One anthropologist who spent time with him on the fairgrounds, he taught her a complicated string trick, which she recorded in her book as the first string trick ever recorded from Africa, and she seemed to be really shocked that an African could do one of these string tricks. He was said to have a real sense of humor. The people who knew him in Lynchburg, Virginia, told many stories about his sense of humor and also how beloved he was. He would take the children of Lynchburg into the forest and teach them the ways of the forest, and he would regale the children with stories of, hunting elephants and, the way that he lived in the Congo. And he also would regularly perform a ritual in which he would dance around a fire, kind of chanting and singing. But his people were known for their celebration of the forest, of nature. They had lived in a certain way for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. From the time of the pharaohs, and so he brought those ceremonies and rituals to his life in the United States.
You mentioned Lynchburg, Virginia, which is where he ultimately wound up, and that's jumping ahead a little bit in the story. Well, we will get to it here in a second. In the sensation, the spectacle, the to great acclaim, this exhibit of this man, the tide of public opinion started to turn fairly quickly after the first, I guess, week of the exhibition.
Well, what was happening is, so as the ministers began to protest, the protests picked up steam across the country by other black ministers, and a handful of white businessmen and a minister in New York, actually, a white ministers, the first one who objected to the exhibit, Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur. But I think it was more Ota Benga's resistance to captivity. As the weeks went on, he began to kick, bite, do whatever he could not to be put back on display. And so to appease him and to appease some of the critics, they would sometimes let him out of the cage with a keeper to kind of amble through the woods. And when the spectators would spot him, they would chase him, kick him, trip him. And so that became yet another kind of scandal on the grounds of the zoo. And so more and more of that kind of unwanted attention made zoo officials very eager to get rid of Ota Benga.
And we should point out that the one important newspaper in New York at that time that did object to this right from the start was the New York Journal, which was a Hearst newspaper.
Exactly.
And it called this display disgusting, a shameful disgrace to every man in any way connected with it. So that, I guess, propelled the opposition, and they, as you say, wanted to get rid of him. And eventually, kind of spirited him out the back door, so to speak, off to Brooklyn to an orphanage.
Right. The Howard Colored Orphanage for children. So he was taken there, given his own room, treated like a guest, but they then sent him to Lynchburg. The idea was to send him to a seminary to train him to be a missionary and then send him back to Africa to help his people. But he quickly was returned to New York because the pastor who took him in died suddenly. And then he spent a few years at the orphanage. They had a farm in Long Island. And so he spent a few years out in Long Island in Smithtown and St. James, actually. And then he ended up back in Lynchburg.
And at Lynchburg, it was what facility?
So it was the same seminary, the Virginia Theological Seminary, black seminary that, as I said, trained missionaries, among other things. And but he went to school for a time, and then he stopped going to class, but he was embraced. First, one of his teachers was Anne Spencer, who turned out to be one of the most famous poets during the Harlem Renaissance. She later moved to Harlem and, became a renowned poet. But anyway, while there, so she took him in as, one of her kind of mentees, and he just became a beloved figure. So even though he no longer went to class, he took on all kind of odd jobs and was trying to save money to go back home, but a world war had broken out. It would have been pretty unlikely that he could have saved enough money to get back to the Congo. It was a very expensive trip, and also you would need permission from Leopold or from someone to even enter the Congo.
Leopold, who is not the friendliest regent to the population of the Congo. The atrocities committed under King Leopold II in what I guess was called the Belgian Congo in those days are just, they caused someone to coin the term crimes against humanity.
Exactly.
Is what Leopold was guilty of. So who knows if Ota Benga had been able to apply what would have happened. But more tragic is the way he ended in Virginia. At 25, he committed suicide.
Yeah, he was feeling hopeless. Many people had observed he had become increasingly despondent. He wanted to go home. This young man who had been captured, brought to the United States, humiliated, degraded, in the worst way imaginable, right? Exhibited with an ape in the zoo, and separated from his home, his friends, his family, the life he had known. So for 10 years, he tried to make his way here, but he was a pretty alienated figure, even in a place where people kind of took him in and treated him, like a friend.
You teach journalism at NYU, of course, and I wonder how has writing this book informed your classes, the teaching that you do at NYU?
Well, I guess I've always taught my students to be kind of skeptical about what they read, and to, when possible. I mean, as you know, one of the things that journalists often don't have the luxury of is going to archives to do primary research. But to the extent that you can ground your journalism in history, and in history that has credibility, I think it makes your journalism that much stronger.
Well, and you don't come right out in the book, and rightly so. There's no reason for it. It's not necessary. But what we're talking about here is attitudes toward a race.
Right.
In this case, the African Americans, but it could be the attitudes of Americans of the time to the Italian immigrants, to the German
Oh my
immigrants,
goodness.
to the Polish immigrants,
Right.
to the Jewish immigrant. And there are echoes in the
Definitely.
headlines.
There
today.
are echoes, and I think, our eagerness to declare ourselves post-race, are premature because,
To say the least.
to say the least, because much of what we see now, these young black men being shot in the back or in the chest by police, and it turns out they were unarmed and innocent of any crime that anyone knew. When we look beneath the act to the ideology, we can find it embedded in this book. But if we follow that trail, there's no reason to believe that these attitudes would not still be with us, because they've been so deeply ingrained in our national psyche.
The book is Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga. You need to get this book. You need to read this book. And then you need to go to the zoo and ask them, why do they not recognize this horrible piece of their own history? Anyway, Pamela Newkirk, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Delight to talk to you. And we will see you. We look forward to seeing you next week.